Hey everyone, so we're starting on Module 7, which is separated by spring break from Module 8, of course, but really Module 7 and Module 8 kind of go hand in hand. So for the next two modules, the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at the roles and functions of counselors, rehabilitation counselors, and mental health counselors. For this week, I have kind of separated the two, and I want to preface this presentation by saying that what I'm talking about in terms of the role of a rehab counselor versus mental health counselor are the more traditional roles that these two counseling specialty areas tend to hold, okay? Now, with depending on region, depending on agency, depending on a number of different things, a rehab counselor may be performing services that reflect that of what a traditional mental health counselor might be doing. Mental health counselors might be doing a little bit more rehab. It just depends on the situation, depends on where you're working. So I wanted to just kind of provide that as an opener to the rest of this week's lecture. Also for this week, I have a number of different videos, and so a year ago or so, and I feel like after this year we'll probably have to update them a bit, but we were able to interview a number of counselors that are working out there in the field right now, and we asked each of them a set of questions that were the same. We wanted to hear about their experiences as counselors, what their work consisted of, highlights of their work, what they found to be most interesting, things that they found to be a little less interesting, any ethical dilemmas or situations that might come up for them. A number of the people that you'll be listening to, the counselors you're going to be listening to, you may have in class actually, and they may be adjunct for our program right now, but more importantly, to a degree, they are graduates of either the rehabilitation counseling program. It could be back in the day before it was the combined rehab counseling, mental health counseling specialty, but a graduate of our program or the clinical mental health counseling program, which is right next door to us. So these are people that are working in Morgantown and elsewhere, and have a wealth of backgrounds, different certifications that they're going to talk about, and so I hope that you find it interesting and useful. It's one thing for me to tell you about the roles of counselors, what people do on a day-to-day basis. It's another for you to hear about it, to hear about what actual counselors who are in the field practicing are doing. So I hope you do find it interesting. And then in Module 8, we're just going to get a little bit more in depth into the roles, again, the functions of counselors. And so what I want you to be doing is starting to think, where do you see yourself? And I know a lot of you came into the program with an idea of where you want to be working, and that is perfectly fine. You know, that's great. I know some of you maybe didn't. You just know you want to be a counselor and you want to help other people. And so hopefully these next two modules will help give you a little bit of a better understanding of what people actually do. Because I know going into even my practicum, I thought, great, I'm going to be a counselor. That means I'm going to be working with clients every day, and it's going to be fantastic, and I'm just going to get to talk to people. And this is a more traditional rehab counseling role. I quickly realized that there is a great deal of paperwork and documentation and case management that comes along with the job, and that leaves less and less room to have those one-on-one conversations with clients. So, you know, you really just kind of have to think about where you want to be in the future, and a lot of that depends on, you know, where you see yourself working, what kind of atmosphere, you know, where do you see yourself working in 9 to 5 versus working weekends and in the evenings. It just depends. But hopefully these next couple of modules will get you thinking about that. I also wanted to mention that I went ahead and opened up Module 8 because this is down the road, of course, but your site identification project is going to be due relatively soon. And for that project, you have to be actually contacting sites. You might think, why are we doing this so early, Dr. Simpson? My practicum isn't for forever. My gosh, it's so far down the road. Well, there's a thing called competition. And so even if you don't live in Morgantown, where you might be competing with other counseling students and social work students for sites, you're probably living in an area where other people are looking for sites too. And so the purpose of this assignment was to get you started thinking through where in your community you might want to do placement for your clinical experiences. Not only that, but making contact with people. So I want you to start kind of developing a list of potential sites. thinking about who to contact. And for this assignment in particular, I don't want to see that you're just kind of going on a website and reaching out via email and that's it. It's hard to get in touch with people, and I get that. But if you want to find a practicum site, you're going to have to be a little bit relentless, right? Be the squeaky wheel that gets the oil for the practicum and internship placement site that you want at the top of your list, okay? So even if if you're working right now, that's going to be where your practicum and internship site is, I still want you to go and look at other facilities as well, because you never know what's going to happen. So be thinking about that, be thinking about making contacts, developing a list of contacts. Sometimes it might take going in and talking to a receptionist, okay, or an admin. That's perfectly fine. It might be very difficult to get a counselor on the phone, and that's understandable. They're very busy people, as I will now explain within these 2 Module 7 PowerPoints, which I'm just going to kind of combine together in one video today, okay? So starting out with rehabilitation counseling, what do rehab counselors do? So rehab counselors in general kind of work in these 4 different areas. These are places of employment for rehab counselors. The public vocational rehab agency system is throughout the country, and it employs the largest number of vocational rehabilitation counselors in the country. And so we see a lot of our rehab counselors going into places of employment within the public VR system. State VR systems, the name differs from state to state, depends on where you live. Sometimes it's the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. Sometimes it's Rehabilitation Services of such and such state. So it just depends, but every state has them. Remember, as we were learning about the Rehabilitation Act, part of what the Rehab Act did was help to fund these public rehab agencies, okay? So these are the state agencies, job service offices. There's also state assistive technology projects or agencies that exist, again, in all 50 states, and they are partially funded through the federal government, and they are they're mandated by a different law, assistive technology related law. So state AT projects often work hand in hand with rehab counseling agencies, with state agencies, because they're the providers sometimes of assessments, of assistive technology assessments. They have loan libraries where people can come in and try out a piece of equipment to see if it's going to work for them. They have, for example, here in Morgantown, our state AT project is located near the airport where the Center for Excellence in Disabilities is, and you can go in and you can tour the state AT project. They have like a room that's set up like a house with different pieces of AT. They've got a modified kitchen, so individuals that, let's say, use a wheelchair, if they need to have modifications to their kitchen, ovens, countertops, things of that nature, the AT project can kind of show the equipment that's out there, allow somebody to come in and try some stuff before they actually go and do a full-blown modification. State AT projects are a great place to refer clients to as well. If a client is having, and this goes for mental health counseling too, if a client is having difficulty accessing information, their computer, vision impairments, hearing impairments, whatever it might be, these agencies exist to assist people in figuring out what type of technology can help supplement their access to different areas of life. Second agency or kind of place of employment for rehab counselors is within the VA system, again, as job placement type counselors, as rehab counselors for the federal government. Private nonprofit would be grant-funded programs which pop up and go away and pop up and go away. Centers for Independent Living, if they felt it necessary to hire a rehab counselor, they could. Advocacy agencies as well might look into hiring a rehab counselor that might have additional background in law, for example. Private for profit, that would be the insurance companies, workers' compensation agencies, which are throughout every state. Insurance companies being like long-term disability insurance, those are the big insurance people. Like I used to work for Cigna as a long-term disability vocational rehabilitation counselor. They have vocational rehab counselors in all of the big insurance companies to get people off of disability and back into a place of employment, right? Saving money. And private practice, of course. So, for any rehab counselor, you guys are all included in this because you're going to be kind of both, right? But any rehab counselor that looks to get their additional hours in and obtain licensure can open up a private practice. So a number of different areas of employment. So once you're into the kind of the area of employment, what is the counselor doing, let's say? And so the careers within rehab counseling are vast as they are in mental health counseling, and you'll see a lot of overlap between these two. Some of what differs with rehab counseling, you might see rehab counselors being return to work coordinators. So larger corporations now are seeing the value of hiring somebody with a rehab counseling background in-house. And so they might have somebody that will come in. I'm going to throw out Amazon just because they've got tons of warehouses. I don't know for sure if they employ rehab counselors, but it'd be smart if they did. But somebody that has a rehab counseling background can come in, look over job tasks, see if there's a likelihood for repetitive strain or repetitive motion type injuries. They can make modifications to how job tasks are doing. If somebody is injured on the job, they might be working hand in hand with a rehab counselor through workers' compensation to see how they could get an employee back on the job. Rehab counselors might work in leave or absence management programs. This can be for hospital settings, corporations, even within higher education. Again, all to facilitate that process of getting an employee who was either injured on the job or potentially even off the job back to work sooner. Some skills in particular that need to be honed in, and when you're looking at being a rehab counselor, okay, lots of them. And of course, being a therapist or counselor is part of that, as rehab counseling title would allude to, right? But kind of the main or bigger difference between rehab counseling and mental health counseling is the need to be kind of like a case manager, do a lot of case management and case coordination, to be a member of a multidisciplinary team where you're working with somebody that has a disability who also has medical providers. If you're working with a youth or young adult with a disability, they might be transitioning from high school, and so you're also working with special ed teachers, you're working with IEP teams, school psychologists, school counselors. And so a rehab counselor might be kind of facilitating a job development process for a client that does involve all these other key players because it has to, because we're working with somebody that has a disability and therefore has limitations that we have to take into consideration as part of the process of figuring out what career will ultimately be a good fit for them and lead toward continued employment. I put knower of random things in there because, again, this will go for mental health counseling too, but for rehab counselors, mental health counselors, clients come to us with all different kinds of questions. They may want to know how to access different services. Where can they go to get their house modified? How can they access transportation? Are there any grant programs they could take advantage of to help pay for maybe like a new type of technology or medical expense or something like that? Where do they go to find out information about medical benefits? So we have to be kind of a knower of all these random things, just a little nugget of knowledge so that we can point our clients in the right direction. The worst thing I think we could, not worst thing, but probably top 10 of the worst things that we can tell a client is, I don't know, good luck with that, okay, as a response to a question. So we should always be kind of gathering some information, making community connections so we can get our clients the help that they might need, even if that's not what we're supposed to be doing. Areas of expertise for rehab counselors, of course, the counseling piece of it, coordination, consultants, providing directions to families, working with employers. So a rehab counselor that's doing the job placement, job development process for a client might be also engaging with employers and making those business connections so that they know what jobs are open in the community and they've got a contact. They know the general manager at a restaurant or at a packaging facility or at a hospital, whatever it might be, so they can make that contact directly when they have a client that they think would be a good fit for the employer or a client that's interested in that type of job. They can call somebody up and say, hey, I've got somebody that is interested in coming in and doing some job shadowing. Are you available to do that? So a lot of times what rehab counselor would do is just kind of, again, make these connections out there. In terms of case management, I would say one of the biggest areas of difference that we see between rehab counselors and mental health counselors and even rehab counselors in the private sector versus the public sector is the number of clients you will have on your caseload, okay? So a rehab counselor working in the public sector, so somebody working at a state VR agency, is going to see a caseload in the hundreds, okay, and I'm being conservative with that. Well, probably not 1,000, okay, but 100+ cases is relatively common for somebody working in the public VR system. Now, if you're talking about in rural states, those frontier type areas, there might be one state voc rehab counselor managing 3 different counties in one of the largest rural states in the country, and so they may be the sole person that has a caseload of almost 200 potentially, and so that there's a big difference there. For the private sector in rehab counseling, caseloads are much smaller. For me, and I know this differs for every private sector voc rehab counselor, but our agency and our supervisors kind of liked us to keep it in the 50 client range, which is much more manageable. The difference was there was a quicker turnover, I think, in the private sector, where in the public sector you might have somebody on your caseload for years because they're going through school and you're supporting them. So it just depends on the client population as well. Being a self-critic is crucial, of course, for any counselor, because we have to be able to monitor and critique our own work. We have to be constantly asking ourselves if we are providing equal services to our client base, or are we showing preference towards one client population over another. In rehab counseling, we see more of an emphasis in the past, I would say 5 years more than ever, on the counselor part of our job title. So if counseling is part of the job title, why are we not doing as much counseling? And so there's been literature that talks about the time spent with clients for rehab counselors, and there's a good portion of time that's spent doing all the other things, the paperwork, the case management stuff, the phone calls. So there's more time spent on these other things. And when you take into consideration the higher caseload, well, certainly it's more difficult to see somebody and sit down face to face and have a full hour session that's counseling based for a rehab counselor working in the state system, simply because there's not enough time in the day to do that. I do think that educational trends have changed this, in addition to laws like WIOA, where there's different ways that services can be provided, so that we're freeing up more time for rehab counselors to provide some dedicated counseling service to clients. Where else am I going with this? So job responsibilities for a rehab counselor, especially within the public sector, you're kind of following a process where you're looking over an application for eligibility, you are making eligibility determinations, intake interviews are being done, sometimes by a rehab counselor, sometimes by somebody else who's strictly there to do intakes. You're looking at diagnoses, you're looking at medical documentation as part of the process. Developing individualized plans for employment. And now it's because I'm working on a grant where I'm looking at IEPs and IPEs. I myself am getting them all confused in my head. But rehab counselors are also making sure that their clients that have been placed in jobs are being successful, seeing if they need accommodations, providing post-employment services, following up if needed, to make sure that clients are where they need to be. Advocating is a big part of what a rehab counselor does as well, and I think again, there's a lot of overlap between job responsibilities here, but we're always an advocate for our clients when our clients are having difficulty maintaining employment. It might be that we're kind of getting in there and showing an employer different types of accommodations that could be made so a client with a disability can continue to work, continue to be productive and meet productivity standards. We might be working directly with HR managers, personnel, contractors to ensure client success at the end of the day. Or providing training as well, providing training to HR departments on their obligations to provide accommodations, how to recruit individuals with specific types of disabilities, and the value that people with disabilities can bring to an employment setting. And after all of that, of course, a counselor-client relationship has to be maintained, right? Another part of rehab counseling that I think is a little bit different than mental health counseling, especially mental health counselors that have private practices, is that rehab counselors have got to be perfectly okay with change. Change in policies and job roles and caseload numbers, all of that, especially within the private or public sector, the public sector of voc rehab. We've seen, as we now know with all of these laws, how different political administrations can come in and change things, shift things, amend different laws, and what happens after that is that it trickles right down to the laps of the VR counselors. And so laws like WIOA, WIOA, that were enacted, or it was a restructuring of a law, or amending a law that was already in place, but really shifted the job role as a result of that amendment. It shifted the job role of a rehab counselor pretty drastically. So sometimes that's needed, but it is interesting as a rehab counselor to know that in some ways the job role that you have could be changed by politics. And that's not something you always see in mental health counseling. Now, what do you see in mental health counseling is legislation that impacts healthcare benefits is something that might impact you as somebody in the private sector in mental health counseling. So let's kind of move over to the next set of slides for the roles and functions of mental health counselors. Take a break if you need it. If not, we'll push on through. So employment as a mental health counselor, again, just some general areas that people with mental health counseling degrees typically work. Private practice. I add in family, but I always like to state that there's a caveat with that. Depending on the state that you're working in, how you're promoting your services, individuals that say that they're a family counselor or couples and family counselor or LMFT sometimes need to have that actual designation, licensed marriage and family therapist, okay? Depending on how your state works and requires things to be for licensure. So, and with an LMFT, generally speaking, I've not found this anywhere listed any other way, you have to have a degree in that. So, typically, you might be seeing a family, but may not be promoting yourself as a designated, tried and true LMFT, right? Unless you're licensed or marriage and family counselor. But we all know that people that work in private practice and elsewhere in agencies too see clients have families, you see the family. In higher education or career counseling, so these are like a WVU, career services, or the Caruth Center, those the individuals that staff those positions have mental health backgrounds typically, or sometimes counseling psychology, but so there's a lot of competition for jobs, generally speaking. But this is an area, of course, that mental health counselors can work. Correctional facilities, federal government, we've seen, especially within the federal government, more movement because of professional advocacy on the part of the ACA and counselors across the country. We could have a space at the table so that mental health counselors who are licensed can actually see veterans that are returning from overseas and deployments, whereas before it was limited to social workers. So that has been a major job opening for mental health counselors in very recent years, in fact. A lot of, again, the careers are similar, employee assistance programming through employers. So that's another area that people don't always know about. Larger employers, again, I'll put WVU in the mix with that, provide employee assistance programs to their employees as a benefit of employment. And sometimes part of that is the provision of mental health counseling services. Sometimes that happens through telehealth counseling, just on the telephone or video chatting, or dedicated kind of services within the actual organization itself. Some different skills, again, a lot of the knower of random things remains on this list. In mental health counseling, there's, of course, that stronger emphasis on providing counseling, providing therapy from a theoretical orientation that's grounded in evidence-based practices. But, of course, depending on where somebody works, if they're working for an agency, inpatient, outpatient treatment facility, you may still be working with psychologists, psychiatrists, medical providers. You may be working with individuals within a correctional facility as well. I know I've had colleagues that worked in the prison system as counselors, like in Allegheny County Jail. I had a friend that worked there, and so she worked under psychiatrist, I believe, but she was able to maintain employment there after she got a doctorate degree. So job opportunities everywhere, and of course in private practice too. Job responsibilities. So with mental health counseling, I would say that in terms of comparing the two, there's more of an emphasis on doing the intake individually for a mental health counselor, providing assessments, different types of assessments, providing a diagnosis. That's not typically something a rehab counselor is going to do, provide a diagnosis, but in mental health counseling we do see that as a function of the job. Eligibility determinations, again, this could be for an agency if somebody's eligible for services or not, based on whatever condition they're presenting. The provision of counseling is largely based on the population somebody's working with, and a lot of that can be the theoretical orientation too. So you might see that if you're working in a substance use treatment facility, the motivational interviewing is kind of the foundation of some of the counseling services provided. If you're working in an outpatient mental health facility, you might see that dialectical behavior therapy might be something that people gravitate towards, or of course cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's what everybody does. It's a kind of the golden standard, right? And so depending on where somebody works, the way in which they provide services might be a little bit different. And different specialty areas. So this is one thing I think that's again a big difference between rehab counselors and mental health counselors. There's a lot of different specialty areas that somebody with a mental health counseling background, including yourselves with both of them, can focus on. Things like play therapy, working with children, art therapy, working outdoors or working in outdoor settings, kind of the adventure therapy, working within schools, depending on, so we're seeing, again, because of, I think, professional advocacy and a shift in our understanding of mental health in our country, we're seeing that there's been a push more recently to have mental health counselors in schools, in addition to the school counselors, or at least associated with schools, so that if there is some type of trauma or crisis or event that happens in the school systems, there's a mental health counselor there that can help the kids too. So that's, I think, a budding area, which makes sense. My goodness, why would we not have both the school counselors who do their amazing thing with their students, but also have the additional resource of a mental health counselor there too. And private practice, again, one of the bigger areas. So in private practice, you're working when you want, you're setting your hours of employment, right? If you're in private practice, typically you're a contract worker, so you're able to say, this is my, how many people I want to be taking. These are the hours in which I want to work. You can be pursuing other employment. So, for instance, faculty members or people could be doing adjunct work plus having private practice, or you could be a faculty member and then kind of doing a little bit of counseling on the side. We see that a lot with a lot of our faculty here at WVU and elsewhere, of course. Consulting, being somebody that helps with program evaluation on the side. Things to consider: there is a business side to running a private practice. There are ethical things that come up in private practice too that maybe you just have to kind of get ahead of more so in private practice, being able to develop your own professional disclosure statements, limits to confidentiality, things of that nature, where in an agency setting, somebody else is doing that for you. In private practice, you're going to need to go out and find your own attorney that you can consult with. In an agency setting, there's probably somebody on retainer for you. Need to be aware of state laws around licensure. I hopefully have beat that into you all in the past couple of weeks, that we all understand now the differences between each state in terms of obtaining licensure and what supervision might look like. Working independently is a big part of private practice too. A lot of times people that are in private practice will work in the same office and be able to still consult with each other, which is such an integral part of our jobs as counselors, to be able to consult with other professionals. But some will work out of their homes, and so for that reason, I think that if that were a path that you wanted to take, it still is important to maintain connections, to continue to have kind of a pod of people that you've met, maybe colleagues through this program or in your community, that you can still get together with and have some case consultation with when you need to. Insurance billing. again, can be the biggest headache for people in private practice and in agency settings too, depending on if there's somebody that manages that within an agency. And there may be limits to how long somebody can be seen based on insurance, whereas in on the rehab counseling side of it, it's not that somebody coming into state vocational rehab is not going to just be limited to 8 different sessions with the voc rehab counselor. Things might be time limited, or there might be a set amount of money that may be able to be spent to help provide services for somebody, but it's not likely going to be after 10 sessions, that's it. It's going to be, there's no private pay, right, in the public system. So those are kind of the key differences in terms of the roles of rehab counselors and mental health counselors. Hopefully I didn't confuse you more, but I hope, again, that listening to the counselors and their videos will help you have a better understanding of what the job actually looks like. That's what we're here for, right? To figure out what the job looks like and whether or not, where you see yourself working in the future. I've taken up enough of your time. I'll see you on the discussion board, and have a wonderful spring break.